The camera phones came out instantly when the tourists spotted him. Standing perfectly still in his red tunic and bearskin hat, the young royal guard looked like an easy target for their entertainment. They crowded around him, making faces, shouting jokes, and waiting for him to break his famous composure. What they didn't know was that beneath that stoic expression lay the eyes of a man who had stared death in the face on the battlefields of Afghanistan. The tourists saw a statue in fancy dress. The truth was far more extraordinary. This is the story of Private James Mitchell, whose journey from a war-torn village in Helmand Province to the gates of Buckingham Palace would challenge everything these laughing strangers thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Private James Mitchell took his position at the main gate. At 24 years old, he had been serving as a royal guard for only 3 months, but he had already mastered the art of standing perfectly still for hours. His red tunic was pressed to perfection, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his famous bearskin hat sat exactly as regulation demanded. James had learned to focus on a fixed point in the distance, allowing his mind to drift while his body remained rigid. Today, that fixed point was a street lamp about 50 meters away, its black iron surface weathered by decades of London rain. He had been standing for nearly an hour when the first group of tourists appeared. They were Americans, he could tell from their loud voices and casual clothing. A family of 5 with matching baseball caps and oversized cameras hanging from their necks. The father, a heavy-set man in his 50s, approached first with a wide grin. "Look at this guy," the father called to his family. "He's like a robot or something." The man stepped closer to James, close enough that the guard could smell his coffee breath. "Hey buddy, you in there?" the tourist said, waving his hand in front of James's face. James's training kicked in automatically. His breathing remained steady, his eyes fixed on that distant street lamp. He had been prepared for this. All royal guards were briefed on how to handle tourist interactions. They were told to expect rudeness, attempts to make them laugh, and sometimes even physical contact. The job required absolute discipline. The tourist's wife joined her husband, pulling out her phone to record. "Make him smile, honey," she encouraged. "Do something funny?" Their teenage daughter rolled her eyes but couldn't help giggling when her father started making exaggerated facial expressions inches from James's face. The younger twins, 2 boys around 8 years old, began imitating the guard's rigid posture, marching around in circles while their parents laughed. More tourists began to gather, drawn by the commotion. A group of college students from Australia pushed their way to the front, already recording with their phones. One of them, a blonde girl with multiple piercings, dared her friend to touch the guard's hat. "He can't do anything," she said confidently. "They're not allowed to move unless there's real danger." James felt the familiar tightness in his chest that he had learned to control. These tourists saw him as entertainment, a living statue placed there for their amusement. They had no idea who he was or what he had been through to earn the right to stand in this position. A businessman in an expensive suit stopped to watch, shaking his head with amusement. "I don't understand why they still do this," he said to his companion. "It's so outdated. These guards are probably just kids who couldn't get real jobs." The word stung more than James expected. He had heard similar comments before, but they never got easier. The businessman had no idea that James had voluntarily left a promising career in engineering to serve his country. He didn't know about the rigorous selection process, the months of training, or the deep honor that came with wearing this uniform. More tourists arrived throughout the morning. A group of teenage boys from Germany tried to distract James by dropping coins near his feet, hoping he would look down. An elderly couple from Japan respectfully took photos from a distance, but even their quiet presence felt invasive after hours of harassment. By noon, the crowd had grown to nearly 30 people. Someone had started a social media live stream, and comments were flooding in from viewers around the world. Most were encouraging people to try to make the guard react, treating him like a challenge to be conquered rather than a human being doing his job. A young woman from France approached with a baby in her arms. "Maybe he likes children," she said to her husband. She held the baby up close to James's face, hoping the infant might break his concentration. When that failed, she began making baby noises herself, bouncing the child up and down. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The woman was using her own child as a prop in this game, turning what should have been an innocent moment into another attempt to break his composure. He thought about his own nephew, back home in Manchester, and how proud the little boy was when James told him about becoming a royal guard. The Australian students had been filming for over an hour now, taking turns trying different tactics. One pretended to trip and fall near James, hoping to trigger an instinctive reaction. Another started telling increasingly inappropriate jokes, trying to shock him into responding. A third began discussing fictional scenarios where the guard might break character, each more ridiculous than the last. What if someone stole his hat, one suggested. What if we told him his girlfriend was here, another added. What if we said there was a bomb? The third student's suggestion made the others laugh, but it hit James like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind unbidden. The sound of explosions in the Afghan desert. The acrid smell of smoke and burning metal. The faces of friends who didn't make it home. His hands, steady as steel on the outside, trembled almost invisibly at his sides. The businessman who had made the earlier comment about real jobs was still watching, now on his phone with what sounded like a work call. "Yeah, I'm at the palace," James could hear him saying. "Just watching these toy soldiers play dress up. Complete waste of taxpayer money if you ask me." James wanted to tell him about the months he had spent in Helmand province, where every day brought the possibility of death. He wanted to explain how he had earned 3 commendations for bravery, how he had saved the lives of civilians caught in crossfire, how he had held dying friends in his arms while calling for medical evacuation. But his duty was to stand silent, to represent something larger than himself. The uniform he wore connected him to centuries of tradition, to countless men and women who had served before him. Every thread of the red tunic, every gleaming button, carried the weight of history and sacrifice. The crowd continued to grow as the afternoon wore on. Someone had apparently posted about the stubborn guard on social media, because people were arriving specifically to see him. They came with prepared jokes, practiced faces, and elaborate plans to break his composure. A group of street performers gathered nearby, hoping to use the audience that had formed around James for their own show. They began juggling and making loud noises, adding to the chaos of voices and camera clicks that surrounded the young guard. James's shift was supposed to end at 4 o'clock, but the crowd showed no signs of dispersing. If anything, it was growing larger and more aggressive. Someone had brought a portable speaker and was playing music, trying to get him to dance. Children were running between his legs, their parents laughing and encouraging them instead of calling them back. Through it all, James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on that distant street lamp. But, inside, he was fighting a battle that none of these tourists could see. Every joke, every attempt to humiliate him, every casual dismissal of his service added weight to memories he was still struggling to process. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had faced enemy fire with less stress than he felt standing here, surrounded by his own countrymen and visitors who saw him as nothing more than entertainment. In Afghanistan, at least he had been able to fight back. Here, his greatest act of courage was to remain absolutely still while the world tried to tear him down. As the shadows grew longer and the afternoon light began to fade, James knew that his real test was just beginning. These tourists had no idea that they were about to learn something that would change their perception forever. But, first, he had to survive the remainder of his shift with his dignity and his composure intact. The crowd pressed closer, phones held high, everyone wanting to be the one who finally made the royal guard break. They had no idea they were standing in the presence of a hero whose story would soon leave them speechless. As the late afternoon sun began to cast deeper shadows across the palace courtyard, the crowd around Private James Mitchell had swollen to over 50 people. What had started as casual tourist curiosity had evolved into something more aggressive and determined. Social media had amplified the situation, with live streams and posts drawing more people to the scene. James could feel sweat beginning to form beneath his heavy bearskin hat, but his training kept him motionless. His breathing remained controlled, his gaze fixed on that same street lamp that had been his anchor for nearly 6 hours. But, beneath the surface, something was beginning to shift. A new group had arrived, college students on a gap year trip through Europe. They had clearly been drinking, and their approach was more confrontational than the earlier tourists. The ringleader, a tall young man with bleached hair, pushed through the crowd with the confidence that comes from privilege and alcohol. "This is pathetic," he announced loudly. "Look at him just standing there like an idiot. What kind of grown man plays dress up for a living?" His friends laughed, emboldened by his bravado. One of them, a girl with expensive clothes and an entitled smirk, pulled out her phone and started recording. "Watch this," she said. "I'm going to make him crack." She approached James and began making increasingly inappropriate gestures, trying to get a reaction. When that failed, she started making personal comments about his appearance, his intelligence, and his worth as a human being. The crowd around them was eating it up, laughing and encouraging her to go further. James felt his jaw clench slightly, the first crack in his composure. The girl noticed immediately. "Oh, he's getting angry," she called out to her friends. "Look, I think I'm getting to him." The bleached hair leader stepped closer, close enough that James could smell the beer on his breath. "You know what I think," he said loudly. "I think this guy's a coward. I bet he's never seen real action in his life. Probably failed out of basic training and got stuck with this joke job." The words hit James like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind again, more vivid this time. The convoy that had been hit by an improvised explosive device 3 miles outside Lashkargah. The screaming of wounded soldiers. The weight of Corporal Davies in his arms as he carried him to the medical helicopter, knowing it was already too late. But James held his position, even as his heart rate began to climb. The discipline that had been drilled into him through months of training kept his body locked in place, even as his mind raced with memories he had worked hard to suppress. The crowd was getting more creative and more cruel. Someone had brought a clown nose and was trying to put it on James's face. Another person was making loud noises directly in his ear. A teenager was throwing small pieces of paper at him, seeing if he could get them to stick to the guard's uniform. An elderly man pushed through the crowd, shaking his head with disgust. "This is shameful," he said loudly. "You should all be ashamed of yourselves. This young man is serving his country." For a moment, James felt a flicker of hope that someone understood. But the drunk college student turned on the elderly man immediately. "Oh, serving his country?" he mocked. "Standing still is serving his country? My grandfather fought in actual wars. This guy's just a tourist attraction." The old man's face reddened with anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about, son. These guards are real soldiers. Many of them have seen combat." "Prove it," the college student shot back. "If this guy's such a hero, let's hear his war stories." "Oh wait, he can't talk because he's pretending to be a statue." The crowd laughed at this, and James felt something deep inside him beginning to crack. The casual dismissal of his service, the mockery of everything he had been through, the complete disregard for what the uniform represented, it was becoming harder and harder to bear. A middle-aged woman with a camera pushed her way to the front. She had been taking pictures for over an hour, but now she wanted something more dramatic. "I read online that you can touch them as long as you don't interfere with their duties," she announced. James knew this was completely false, but before he could process what was happening, the woman had reached out and touched his chest, posing for a selfie. The physical contact broke through his defenses in a way that words hadn't. Every instinct he had developed in combat zones screamed at him to react, to defend himself, to establish boundaries. But he remained still, even as more people began to think physical contact was acceptable. Someone ruffled his hair beneath the bearskin hat. Another person adjusted his collar. A child was lifted up to touch his face while the parents laughed and took pictures. The drunk college student saw an opportunity to escalate further. "If he won't react to that, let's see what else we can do," he said with a cruel grin. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a permanent marker. "I'm going to give him a mustache," he announced. "If he's such a tough soldier, he'll stop me." The crowd cheered him on as he approached with the marker raised. James could see the black tip coming toward his face in his peripheral vision. Every combat instinct he had ever developed was screaming at him to move, to defend himself, to take action. But he held his position, even as the marker touched his upper lip. The cold tip of the pen against his skin was more humiliating than any insult they had thrown at him. He was being vandalized like a piece of property while dozens of people watched and recorded. The elderly man who had defended him earlier pushed forward again. "That's enough," he shouted. "You're defacing a member of Her Majesty's Guard. This is criminal behavior." But the crowd was beyond reason now. They had found someone they could torment with impunity, and the mob mentality had taken over. More markers appeared. Someone suggested giving him a beard. Another person wanted to write something on his forehead. James felt his breathing become slightly irregular for the first time in 6 hours. The meditation techniques he had learned to deal with post-traumatic stress were failing him. The crowd noise was becoming overwhelming, triggering memories of chaos and violence that he had worked so hard to process and control. A news crew had arrived, drawn by the social media buzz around the incident. A reporter was setting up for a live broadcast, clearly planning to use James's humiliation as entertainment for the evening news. The camera operator was getting close-up shots of the marker stains on his face. "This is Sarah Jenkins reporting live from Buckingham Palace," the reporter began, "where tourists are having some fun with one of the famous royal guards who, as you can see, maintains his composure even while being decorated with some creative additions to his uniform." The casual tone, treating his degradation as light-hearted fun, pushed James closer to his breaking point. He had volunteered to serve his country, had risked his life for strangers, had lost friends to protect the freedoms these people were now abusing. And this was how he was being repaid. More people were arriving, drawn by the news broadcast and social media posts. Someone had started a hashtag, and people were arriving specifically to add their own artwork to the guard. The situation was spiraling completely out of control. A security guard from the palace appeared at the edge of the crowd, but he seemed uncertain about how to intervene without causing an international incident. The tourists were technically on public property, and the guidelines about interacting with the royal guards were frustratingly vague. James could see the security guard talking into his radio, probably calling for instructions from his superiors. But help seemed far away, and the crowd was becoming more aggressive by the minute. Someone had brought silly string. Another person was making plans to cover him in stickers. The drunk college student was now acting like a ringleader, organizing the crowd's efforts and encouraging them to be more creative. "Come on, people," he shouted. "Let's really test this guy's limits. I bet we can make him move if we try hard enough." He pulled out his phone and started researching ways to break a guard's composure. "It says here that they're only supposed to move if there's actual danger," he read aloud. "So let's see how they define danger." The implications of that statement sent a chill through James. The mob was actively looking for ways to escalate the situation, to push him further than anyone should be pushed. He realized that his ordeal was far from over, and that the worst might be yet to come. As evening approached and the crowd showed no signs of dispersing, James drew on reserves of strength he didn't know he still possessed. The same determination that had carried him through the worst moments of his deployment would have to sustain him now. He had survived enemy fire and the loss of close friends. He would survive this too. But, deep inside, he wondered how much more he could take before something inside him broke permanently. The tourists saw his stillness as weakness, but they had no idea how much strength it was actually taking to remain standing in the face of such systematic humiliation. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Soon, his replacement would arrive for the evening shift. But James knew that what had happened here today would stay with him long after he removed the uniform and returned to his small apartment in London. The crowd was still growing, still pushing, still looking for new ways to break him down. And, somewhere in the back of his mind, memories of Afghanistan were stirring, threatening to break through the careful barriers he had built around them. The real test was just beginning. The evening shift change at Buckingham Palace was still an hour away, but James Mitchell felt like he had been standing for days rather than hours. The marker stains on his face had dried, creating an itchy sensation that he couldn't scratch. The crowd around him had grown to nearly 100 people, with new arrivals being directed to the scene by social media posts and news coverage. As the sun descended lower in the London sky, something unexpected began to happen. The golden hour lighting that photographers love started to illuminate James's face in a way that made the black marker stains look even more stark and humiliating. Someone in the crowd noticed this and began taking artistic photographs, turning his degradation into an aesthetic moment for their social media feeds. The drunk college student who had started the marker incident was now completely in control of the mob. He had appointed himself as the unofficial leader of what he was calling Operation Break the Guard. His followers were taking suggestions from the growing online audience, with people around the world submitting ideas for how to push James further. Someone in the chat says we should try singing, the ringleader announced, reading from his phone. They want us to sing Christmas carols really loudly and see if he joins in. It was July, but the crowd didn't care about the absurdity of the suggestion. They launched into a chaotic rendition of Jingle Bells, their voices completely out of tune and deliberately obnoxious. Some people were singing different songs entirely, creating a cacophony that made James's head throb. The noise was becoming overwhelming, triggering something deep in his memory that he had been trying to keep buried. The chaotic voices of the crowd began to blend with other sounds from his past, sounds that belonged to a dusty forward operating base in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. It had been 18 months ago, during his second deployment. James had been part of a small unit tasked with providing security for a medical convoy traveling between villages to deliver supplies and provide emergency care. The mission was supposed to be routine, but nothing in Afghanistan was ever truly routine. The memory surfaced with startling clarity, more vivid than it had been in months of therapy sessions. James could suddenly smell the diesel fuel and dust of the convoy vehicles, could feel the weight of his combat gear, could hear the nervous chatter of his teammates as they prepared to move out. The crowd's singing grew louder, more aggressive, but James was no longer fully present in the palace courtyard. His mind had transported him back to that scorching July day when everything had gone wrong. The convoy had been moving through a village called Nat Ali when the first shot rang out. James remembered the sudden silence that followed, the way every bird seemed to stop singing at once. Then, the chaos erupted. Automatic weapons fire from multiple directions, the distinctive whistle of rocket-propelled grenades, the screams of civilians caught in the crossfire. Contact, 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 he could hear Sergeant Morrison's voice echoing through his memory, as clear as if the man were standing next to him. Multiple shooters, grid reference 476982. Request immediate air support. Back in the present, the crowd was getting more creative with their harassment. Someone had brought a portable speaker and was playing children's songs at full volume. Others were making animal noises, creating a soundtrack of chaos that eerily mirrored the battlefield confusion that James was reliving in his mind. The memory continued to unfold with terrible clarity. James remembered diving behind a concrete barrier as bullets sparked off the ground around him. The medical convoy had been caught in a perfect ambush, with insurgents positioned in buildings on both sides of the narrow street. Private Davies, barely 19 years old and, on his first deployment, had been riding in the lead vehicle. When the shooting started, he had jumped out to help evacuate wounded civilians from a nearby shop. That's when the sniper found him. James remembered seeing Davies fall, remembered the young soldier's scream echoing off the concrete walls of the village. Without thinking, he had broken cover and sprinted into the kill zone to reach his fallen comrade. The crowd around James was growing more aggressive, mistaking his 1,000-yard stare for increased determination to ignore them. They didn't realize that he was no longer seeing them at all. In his mind, he was back in that village, rounds cracking past his ears as he reached Davies and discovered the extent of the young man's wounds. "Stay with me, Tommy," James could hear himself saying to Davies, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You're going to be fine. Just keep talking to me." But Davies hadn't been fine. The sniper's bullet had caught him in the chest, and, despite James's best efforts to apply pressure to the wound, blood was seeping through his fingers at an alarming rate. The teenager's eyes were wide with fear and pain, and he kept asking about his mother. "Tell her I was brave," Davies had whispered, his voice growing weaker. "Tell her I tried to help people." James had stayed with him in that exposed position for 45 minutes while the firefight raged around them. He had called in their position, organized the medical evacuation, and kept pressure on Davies's wound even as enemy fire forced him to keep his head down. When the helicopter finally arrived, James had carried Davies to the landing zone under covering fire from his unit. He remembered the weight of the young soldier's body, the way Davies's blood had soaked through both of their uniforms, the desperate hope he felt as they loaded him onto the medical helicopter. Davies had died en route to the field hospital. James learned about it 3 hours later when the medics radioed back to confirm the casualty report. The brave young man who had risked his life to help Afghan civilians would never see his mother again. The crowd noise was reaching a crescendo now. Someone had started a chant of "Break! Break! Break!" while others recorded everything for their social media feeds. But James was still trapped in his memory, still kneeling beside Davies in that dusty village street. The aftermath of the ambush had been almost as difficult as the firefight itself. James had been recommended for a commendation for his actions in recovering Davies under fire, but the praise felt hollow when weighed against the loss of his friend. He had started having trouble sleeping, jumping at sudden noises, feeling guilty for surviving when Davies hadn't. The military counselors had assured him that survivor's guilt was normal, that his actions had been heroic, that he had done everything possible to save his friend. But those words provided little comfort during the long nights when he replayed the incident over and over, wondering if he could have done something different. A loud crash brought James partially back to the present. Someone in the crowd had knocked over a metal barrier, and the sound echoed off the palace walls like gunfire. For a moment, James's body tensed, his combat reflexes almost overriding his guard training. The college student who had been organizing the harassment noticed the slight change in James's posture. "Oh, we're getting to him now," he announced triumphantly. "Did you see that?" He moved. But James hadn't moved because of their taunts. The sound had triggered a flashback so intense that for a moment he had been ready to take cover and return fire. The realization of how close he had come to breaking hit him like a physical blow. The crowd was emboldened by what they perceived as progress. They began making louder noises, dropping things, creating as much chaos as possible. They thought they were playing a game, but they were actually prodding at psychological wounds that were still healing. James closed his eyes for just a moment, trying to center himself using the techniques his therapist had taught him. He focused on his breathing, on the feeling of the ground beneath his feet, on the weight of his uniform. But the crowd noise kept pulling him back to Afghanistan, to the moment when Davies had died in his arms. He remembered the memorial service they had held at the forward operating base. Davies's boots, rifle, and helmet arranged in a simple display while the chaplain said words that James couldn't remember. What he did remember was the sound of his own voice reading the letter Davies had asked him to write to his mother. "Mrs. Davies," James had written, "your son died a hero. He risked his life to help people who couldn't help themselves. In his final moments, he asked me to tell you that he was brave and that he tried to help people. I want you to know that he succeeded." Tommy saved the lives of 3 Afghan children that day, and his courage inspired everyone who served with him. The letter had been the hardest thing James had ever written, but he had kept his promise to his dying friend. Mrs. Davies had written back, thanking him for staying with her son and for bringing him home. She had said that the letter was the only thing that gave her comfort in her grief. Now, standing in the palace courtyard with marker stains on his face while tourists mocked him, James wondered if Mrs. Davies would be proud of what he was doing. Was this service meaningful, or was he just a figure of ridicule in a silly costume? The doubt that crept into his mind was almost worse than the harassment from the crowd. In Afghanistan, even when things went wrong, he had known that what he was doing mattered. He was protecting people, serving a purpose larger than himself. But, here, surrounded by mockery and humiliation, that sense of purpose was harder to hold on to. The crowd was planning something new. James could hear them discussing it, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. He was still partially lost in his memories, still holding Davies in that dusty street while bullets flew overhead. What none of the tourists could see was that James's stillness wasn't just training. It was the same composure he had developed under fire, the same ability to stay calm in chaos that had saved lives in Afghanistan. The difference was that there, his composure had been appreciated. Here, it was treated as weakness. As evening approached and the shadows grew longer, James realized that his ordeal was far from over. The crowd showed no signs of dispersing, and social media was bringing more people to the scene. But, somewhere in his mind, Davies's voice was urging him to stay strong, to honor the uniform they had both worn with pride. The real test of his character was just beginning. The sun had nearly set behind the London skyline when fate intervened in the form of an unlikely witness. Margaret Davies, a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, had been walking through the area on her way home from work when she heard the commotion at Buckingham Palace. Margaret worked as a nurse at St. Thomas's Hospital and had taken the long way home to avoid the crowded underground during rush hour. She had been planning to simply walk past the tourist gathering, but something about the scene made her stop and look more closely at what was happening. As she pushed through the edge of the crowd, she could see a young royal guard standing perfectly still while dozens of people harassed him. His face was marked with black ink, his dignity under assault from every direction. Something about his bearing, his composure under pressure, seemed familiar to her. Margaret managed to get closer, squeezing between tourists who were too focused on their victim to notice her. When she finally got a clear look at the guard's face, despite the marker stains, her heart nearly stopped. It was him. Private James Mitchell. The soldier who had held her dying son in Afghanistan 18 months ago. Margaret had never forgotten James's face. She had stared at the photograph he had sent with his letter until she had memorized every detail. This was the young man who had risked his life to save Tommy, who had stayed with him in his final moments, who had carried him to the helicopter under enemy fire. And now he was being tormented by people who had no idea they were humiliating a genuine hero. Margaret felt a surge of rage unlike anything she had experienced since learning of Tommy's death. These tourists were defacing the uniform that her son had died wearing, mocking the service that had cost her everything she held dear. Without thinking, she pushed forward into the crowd. "Stop," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Stop this right now." The drunk college student who had been leading the harassment turned to her with an annoyed expression. "Lady, this is none of your business," he said dismissively. "We're just having some fun with toy soldier here." "That's not a toy soldier," Margaret said, her voice trembling with emotion. "That's Private James Mitchell, and he's a war hero." The crowd fell silent for a moment, confused by the interruption. The college student laughed mockingly. "Oh, you know this guy? Is he your boyfriend or something?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "No," she said clearly. "He's the man who held my son while he died in Afghanistan. He's the soldier who saved my Tommy's life and 3 Afghan children. He's the bravest person you'll ever meet." The silence that followed was profound. Phones that had been recording the harassment were now pointed at Margaret as she continued speaking. "My son's name was Private Thomas Davies. He was 19 years old when he died trying to help civilians in a firefight. This man, this hero you're making fun of, carried my boy to safety under enemy fire." James heard every word, though his training kept him motionless. Seeing Mrs. Davies here, defending him, was almost more than he could bear. He had written to her after Tommy's death, but they had never met in person. He had always wondered if she blamed him for not being able to save her son. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter. "Would you like to hear what Private Mitchell wrote to me about my son?" she asked the crowd, her voice growing stronger. "Would you like to know what kind of man you've been humiliating?" She began to read from the letter, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "Mrs. Davies, your son died a hero. He risked his life to help people who couldn't help themselves. In his final moments, he asked me to tell you that he was brave and that he tried to help people." The crowd was completely silent now. Several people had lowered their phones, suddenly, ashamed of what they had been recording. The college student who had started everything looked uncomfortable for the first time. Margaret continued reading. "I want you to know that Tommy saved the lives of 3 Afghan children that day. When the shooting started, instead of taking cover, he ran toward danger to help people he had never met. That's the kind of man your son was, and that's the kind of courage that inspires everyone who serves with honor." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now, but she kept reading. "I stayed with Tommy until the end, Mrs. Davies. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded by people who loved him and respected his courage. In his final moments, he was thinking of you and how proud you would be of what he had done. The businessman who had earlier mocked James as someone who couldn't get a real job was staring at Margaret with growing shame. The college students who had been so eager to break the guard's composure were now looking at their feet, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Margaret folded the letter carefully and looked directly at the drunk student who had drawn on James's face. This man you've been tormenting earned the military cross for his actions that day. He saved my son's life and brought him home to me. He gave me the chance to bury my boy with dignity instead of leaving him in some foreign field. She turned to address the entire crowd now. Do you understand what you've been doing? You've been humiliating a genuine war hero. Someone who has seen more courage and honor in one day than most of you will see in your entire lives. An elderly gentleman in the crowd stepped forward, removing his hat. Ma'am, I'm sorry, he said quietly. We didn't know. That's exactly the problem, Margaret replied. You didn't know, and you didn't care to know. You saw a uniform and thought it was a costume. You saw a soldier and thought he was a toy. But this man has earned every thread of that uniform. The news reporter who had been treating the situation as entertainment was now recording Margaret's words with a completely different tone. This was no longer a light-hearted story about tourist fun. This was about respect, service, and the hidden stories behind the uniforms we see every day. Margaret walked closer to James, close enough that she could speak to him directly. I know you can't respond, Private Mitchell, she said softly. But I want you to know that your service mattered. What you did for Tommy mattered. And what you're doing now, standing here with dignity despite all of this, that matters too. She reached into her purse again and pulled out a small photograph. It was a picture of Tommy in his uniform, smiling at the camera. She held it up so James could see it in his peripheral vision. Tommy would be proud of you, she said. He would be proud to know that you're still serving, still standing guard, still representing everything good about the military he loved so much. The crowd was beginning to disperse now, shame replacing curiosity. Several people approached Margaret to apologize, though she barely acknowledged them. Her focus was entirely on the young soldier who had given her son dignity in his final moments. A palace security guard had finally arrived and was beginning to move people away from James. The supervisor who came with him took one look at the marker stains on the guard's face and began making radio calls to higher authorities. The college student who had started everything tried to approach Margaret to apologize, but she cut him off. Don't apologize to me, she said firmly. Apologize to everyone who has ever worn that uniform. Apologize to the families who have lost sons and daughters in service to their country. And then, think about what kind of person you want to be. Margaret reached into her purse one more time and pulled out a small packet of wet wipes. Without asking permission from anyone, she began gently cleaning the marker stains from James's face. Her touch was gentle, maternal, and, for the first time in hours, James felt tears forming in his eyes. There, she said when she was finished. That's better. You look like the soldier my son was proud to serve beside. As she stepped back, James wanted desperately to break protocol, to speak to her, to thank her for what she had done. But his duty required him to remain silent, and somehow he knew that Mrs. Davies understood. I'll be watching for you, she said as she prepared to leave. Whenever I walk by here, I'll remember what you did for my boy, and I'll be proud to see you standing guard. Margaret Davies walked away through the dispersing crowd, leaving behind a courtyard that had been forever changed by the truth she had revealed. The tourists who remained were quiet and respectful, many of them looking at James with new eyes. Word was spreading rapidly through social media about what had happened. The hashtags that had been used to mock James were now carrying messages of respect and apology. Videos of Margaret's speech were going viral, and people around the world were learning about the real man behind the uniform. James stood a little straighter as evening approached, his composure restored not just by training but by the knowledge that his service was understood and appreciated by someone who mattered. The memory of Tommy Davies was still with him, but now it carried pride rather than pain. The truth had finally emerged, and everything was about to change. The transformation began almost immediately. Within hours of Margaret Davies's intervention, videos of her speech had spread across every major social media platform. The hashtag that had originally been used to mock James Mitchell was now flooded with messages of respect, gratitude, and shame from people around the world who had witnessed his humiliation. By the time James's replacement arrived for the evening shift, a small crowd had gathered again at Buckingham Palace. But, this time, they came not to harass but to honor. Veterans, military families, and ordinary citizens who understood the weight of service stood in quiet respect as James maintained his post for the final hour of his shift. The college student who had drawn on James's face with the marker had sobered up quickly after Margaret's revelation. He stood at the back of the new crowd, his earlier bravado completely gone. When James's shift finally ended and he marched away from his post, the young man attempted to approach him. "Sir," the student called out, his voice shaking. "Sir, I need to apologize." James, finally, able to speak after 8 hours of silence, stopped and turned to face his tormentor. The young man looked like he had aged years in the past few hours. "I'm sorry," he said, tears forming in his eyes. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought you were just..." "Just what?" James asked quietly, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "Just a guy in a costume," the student admitted. "I never thought about what you might have been through. I never thought about what the uniform meant. I was drunk and stupid and I'm sorry." James studied the young man's face for a long moment. He could see genuine remorse there, real understanding of what had happened. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mark," the student replied. "Mark Thompson. I'm from California. I'm supposed to be seeing Europe before I start university, but I think I need to do something more important first." "What do you mean?" Mark pulled out his phone and showed James a social media post he had written. It was a long, detailed apology that had already been shared thousands of times. In it, Mark described his actions, took full responsibility, and urged others to treat military personnel with the respect they deserve. "I've been getting messages from veterans all over the world," Mark said. "They're telling me their stories, helping me understand what service really means. Some of them are angry, and they have every right to be. But others are just trying to educate me." James nodded slowly. "Service means different things to different people," he said. "For me, it means being part of something larger than myself. It means honoring the memory of friends who didn't make it home." "The lady who stood up for you," Mark said, she said her son died in Afghanistan. "Were you there when it happened?" "I was," James replied simply. "Tommy Davies was a good soldier and a better man. He died trying to save people he had never met." Mark was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "I've been thinking about what I can do to make this right," he said finally. "Just apologizing doesn't seem like enough." Over the following days, Mark Thompson's response to his own actions became a story in itself. He canceled the rest of his European vacation and instead spent his time volunteering at a veterans' charity in London. He reached out to military families, attended remembrance services, and used his social media following to promote awareness about military service and sacrifice. But Mark wasn't the only one whose life was changed by the events at Buckingham Palace. The story of James Mitchell and Margaret Davies had touched something deep in the public consciousness. News outlets around the world picked up the story, but they told it with respect and dignity rather than sensationalism. A major television network arranged for a proper interview with both James and Margaret, giving them the opportunity to tell their stories in their own words. The interview, conducted with sensitivity and respect, allowed viewers to understand not just what had happened that day at the palace, but the broader context of military service and sacrifice. During the interview, Margaret spoke about her son Tommy with obvious love and pride. "Tommy believed in helping people," she said. "That's what got him killed, but it's also what made him the man I was proud to call my son. When I saw Private Mitchell being humiliated, I couldn't stand by and let people mock everything Tommy died for." James, still uncomfortable with being called a hero, tried to shift attention back to the soldiers who didn't make it home. "Tommy Davies saved 3 children that day," he emphasized. The reason I was able to carry him to the helicopter was because he had already done what he set out to do. He didn't fail. He succeeded. The interview revealed other details about James's service that had not been public before. In addition to the military cross he had earned for his actions in Afghanistan, he had received commendations for community service, humanitarian efforts, and leadership under pressure. His decision to become a Royal Guard had been motivated by a desire to continue serving his country in a different capacity. After Afghanistan, I needed some time to process what had happened, James explained. The Royal Guard position gave me the chance to serve with honor while working through some of the psychological challenges that come with combat experience. Standing guard at the palace isn't just ceremonial. It's a continuation of the oath I took to protect and serve. The public response to the interview was overwhelmingly positive. Donations poured into veterans' charities, military families received messages of support, and there was a renewed appreciation for the men and women in uniform. But, perhaps more importantly, there was a broader conversation about how we treat each other, especially when we don't understand someone else's story. Margaret Davies became an unlikely spokesperson for military families, using her experience to advocate for better understanding and support for veterans. She worked with organizations that help soldiers transition back to civilian life, sharing her perspective as someone who had lost a child to war but still believed in the importance of military service. The drunk college student Mark Thompson eventually returned to California, but he had been fundamentally changed by his experience. He changed his major from business to social work and began focusing on veteran affairs. Years later, he would establish a foundation that provides support for military families dealing with loss and trauma. The Australian students who had participated in the harassment also felt compelled to make amends. They organized a fundraiser for Afghan war veterans and used their remaining European vacation to visit military cemeteries and learn about the history of the conflicts their generation had inherited. Even the businessman who had dismissed James as someone who couldn't get a real job was moved to action. He reached out to veteran employment programs and began using his company's resources to provide job opportunities for transitioning military personnel. But the most significant change was in James himself. The ordeal at Buckingham Palace, as traumatic as it had been, ultimately helped him process his experiences in Afghanistan. Margaret's intervention had reminded him that his service mattered, that Tommy's sacrifice had meaning, and that wearing the uniform was an honor rather than a burden. James continued serving as a Royal Guard for 2 more years before transitioning to a new career in veteran advocacy. He used his public profile to raise awareness about post-traumatic stress disorder, the challenges of military transition, and the importance of supporting service members and their families. Margaret Davies and James Mitchell maintained a friendship that lasted for years. She attended his wedding, where he wore his dress uniform with pride. He spoke at memorial services for Tommy, helping other families understand that their loved ones had not died alone or forgotten. The transformation that began with one moment of cruelty and was redeemed by one act of courage rippled outward in ways that none of the participants could have imagined. Social media, which had been used to humiliate and mock, became a tool for education and connection. Veterans who had been struggling with their own transitions found new support networks. Military families who felt isolated discovered communities of people who understood their experiences. And ordinary citizens gained a deeper appreciation for the men and women who served their countries around the world. The story of James Mitchell, Tommy Davies, and Margaret Davies became more than just a viral moment. It became a reminder that behind every uniform is a human being with a story worth knowing, that service and sacrifice deserve respect rather than mockery, and that even our worst moments can be transformed into opportunities for understanding and growth. Years later, when tourists visit Buckingham Palace and see the Royal Guards standing at their posts, many remember the story of the guard who endured humiliation with dignity and the mother who reminded the world what honor really means. They approach with respect rather than ridicule, understanding that they are in the presence of men and women who have earned the right to wear those uniforms through service, sacrifice, and an unshakable commitment to something greater than themselves. The red tunic and bearskin hat are no longer seen as costumes but as symbols of courage, dedication, and the quiet heroism that stands guard while others sleep safely in their beds. And, somewhere in London, James Mitchell continues his service in new ways,